Last week, we talked a lot about faith, and today we're going to talk about hope. 1 Corinthians 13:13, it says, "So now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love." And there are times in my life when I've seen how essential these three things are: faith, hope, and love. There's times we don't want to admit those things are essential, times we want to kind of ignore those things, but man, those things are so important to just how we live life, to life in general. And when we're missing those things, man, the quality of life, it just isn't the same. But I've also found that when one of those things goes awry, when we lose one of those things, often we lose all three. And that's especially true with the greatest of them. When we lose love or when we lose a loved one, I don't think there's anything worse in this world. And often, like this passage today, it can cause hope to almost die. Spoiler alert, though, the message today, it's entitled, "Hope Didn't Die." So we're going to see this widow who has an only son who died, and we're going to find out with her, hope didn't die. So let's get into the passage. We're going to be in Luke chapter 7, verse 11 through 17, and we're going to find out exactly why she lost everything, but hope, it still remained in her life. So verse 11, "Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, 'Do not weep.' Then he came and he touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people.' And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region." Let's pray real quick before we get into this. Father, I thank you for this message today. I thank you for the love, the hope, and the faith that you often give us. And I pray that as we study your word, Lord, you would give us reasons to hope in you. In Jesus' name, amen. So now it happened, or in your version, it may say soon afterwards, that Jesus went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him in a large crowd. So the day before, and that's kind of what it means when it means soon after. In the Greek, it means the next day. The day before, he was meeting the friends of the centurion. And those friends, they had a request from the centurion. And the request was, "Hey, I'm not worthy, but if you just say the word, I have a servant who's near death, but if you just say the word, I know he'll be healed." And man, what amazing faith that was. And the next day, like 24 hours later, he's in Nain. Nain is like 25 miles from Capernaum. And it's a little city. It's never mentioned in all of the Bible again. So what's the big deal about Nain? Why did Jesus feel like after this huge event of faith that he hasn't found in all Israel, after this amazing event, he's like, you know what? I got to go to Nain. 25 miles away. And it's not like he had a donkey or a camel or a car or anything to make this trip. He had to walk 25 miles to get to this new city, this small little city that's 25 miles from Capernaum. Seems like something was important there that Jesus knew about. Like he had a divine appointment. And as we read the passage, we see what was on his mind. We see that Jesus seemed to know because, man, things line up so perfectly that only God could have set this up. Because he's walking into the city, up to the gate, with this huge crowd. And I imagine this crowd had just seen Jesus heal a servant that was close to death with just his word. You know, the centurion rightly said, but if you just say the word, it'll be done. And he had that faith in Jesus' authority and his power, and it happened. And so I imagine these guys are probably talking about it like they were at a football game that just was awesome, and they were like, do you remember when that happened? Like the centurion's friends came up. Do you remember? Like, how amazing was that? And they're probably joyful and just happy and talking. And it's this huge crowd. It's the disciples. It's a lot of his followers walking into the city. And at that exact same time, it says in verse 12, and when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out. So this crowd that's completely joyful, completely happy, they meet this crowd that's mourning, that has a dead man that they're in this procession. And this would have happened not that long ago, probably at the moment that he was healing the centurion's servant, because in Israel, when someone died, you needed to bury that body within 24 hours. So just the next day, a day ago, this young man had died. Young man, in the Greek, we see that he's probably about 20 years old. But it's worse than that. It's not just a young man who died, he's an only son. And the only son to someone who's a widow, to someone who's already been through this kind of grief. But it's even worse because it's a son. And not just a son, but an only son. I don't know if you guys have ever lost somebody. I mean, I hope to God I never lose one of my 4 children. Because, you know, I've heard it said that losing a child is like putting a period in the middle of a sentence. It's so wrong. It makes no sense. For someone who loses a child, it's like their world is gone. Hope is gone. Sometimes even with it, faith is gone because you lost that loved one. You know, I've had close to that. Right after my wife and I got married, soon after, we were having a baby. Found out it was a little girl, and we lost her while my wife was pregnant. You know, we had named her Salem Grace. So excited to meet her. And then complications and we lost her, and that was painful enough. I can't even imagine if we had met her, and if we had lived with her, and if we had known her even more than that. I mean, it still was tremendously painful. But this is the kind of sorrow that joy is meeting. You have this one crowd that's fully joyful, and this other crowd, and it says right there that they came to the gates of the city, and behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. So it wasn't just her grief, but it was the city's grief. The city, that was a small city, they had known this lady. They had known the kind of pain she had went with when it was her husband who died, and now it was her son. And the kind of pain that they felt. And it wasn't just emotional pain. Back then, they didn't have welfare. They didn't have any kind of assistance. So when your husband died as a woman, when your children were dead, you had nothing. She was on her way to becoming destitute, to becoming poor, because women, they couldn't own land. You kind of see that in Ruth with Naomi when she lost her husband and then she lost her sons, and she said, you know what, name me bitter now. And she's like, I'm just going to go back home. Maybe I can live with one of my family members because I got nothing left. And Ruth was like, let me go with you. And she's like, why? Why? Even if I have another son right now, you can't marry him. I've got nothing. Just name me bitter. And there was that kind of sorrow and that kind of pain with Naomi. And she said, well, you know, in Israel, the Lord has visited Israel, and at least there's food there. At least we can go live. And we see throughout the story of Ruth that God redeemed Naomi and Ruth. And we're going to see soon in this story that Jesus, his divine appointment, was this lady right here. It says in the next verse, When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." What is your hope in? Often in this world, that's a question we should ask ourselves, because we can either cope on our own or we can hope in God. And that whole coping on your own, it really doesn't work. I've tried that. I've tried to, on my own, deal with like the pains of life, that when life has kicked me, I learned to just deal with things on my own from a young age. But I found out, none of us are really good at coping on our own. We need hope. And a lot of times the best place we can find hope is with God. And it reminds me so much of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. It says, "Remember that when you were separated from Christ." So Paul's talking to Christians, and he's talking about this time that they didn't know Jesus. So he's like, remember this time when you were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise. You didn't go to church. You didn't have God's promises. It says, having no hope and without God in the world. Do you guys remember a time like that in your lives when you had no hope and you were without God in the world? And it's interesting, that's this lady at this point. She doesn't know Jesus. All she knows is my life is pretty much over. I got nothing left. Literally, my husband's gone. My only child is gone. And she's just mourning. She's without hope and without God. That's when Jesus enters her life. And that's the next point here, is that all hope is lost until Jesus showed up. And it says the Lord. Luke uses this term a lot, but this is the first time that he used it of Jesus. And it's that Greek word Kyrios. It's like the Old Testament word Adonai. And it's this idea of a sovereign one, a master. And so he says, he doesn't say Jesus, he says, when the Lord saw her. And that word saw, it means to behold someone, to stare at them intently, to study them. And so Jesus, he's coming with this crowd of people who are so happy around him. And maybe as they're coming up on this funeral procession, they start to quiet down. Because one thing about Jewish funeral processions is they were loud. Because the louder you mourned, the more you loved someone. It was so much so that they would hire professional mourners, because they wanted everyone to know how much they loved the person who had died. And I imagine, even just with the whole town there, the mourning was loud. That they were wailing and crying and just letting their grief show. And in all this chaos and all this stuff that's going on, as these two crowds meet, Jesus only has eyes for this widow. It says, when the Lord saw her, when the sovereign one beheld her and studied her and looked upon her, he had compassion. A lot of times I think that we don't realize how God looks at us. Even in our darkest moments, especially in our darkest moments. We start getting in our head and we start thinking, man, God, he's got to be disappointed with me. God, he's got to not be happy with me right now because, man, everything's just going wrong. Maybe he's even just punishing me. But Jesus, he goes out of his way. He goes 25 miles to Nan for this one divine appointment, and he finds her, he studies her, and he has compassion. And that word compassion, it's tender, loving concern for someone in need. And how often do you see this in the Gospels? Jesus in the Gospels, he's giving us an example of who he is. And as we see who Jesus is, from Jesus' own words, he's saying, I'm showing you the Father. Because Philip said, hey, man, Jesus, could you just show us the Father? Just show us who God is. And Jesus is like, how long have I been with you? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And how many times in the Gospels do we see Jesus seeking out those who are in need. He even says, I came for the sick. I'm a physician. I want to come for the brokenhearted. I want to come for those who need me the most. And he literally sought this lady out. And the idea here of that he saw her and he had compassion, the idea is that he entered into her sorrow. You know, in Isaiah 53, it says that Jesus is a man acquainted with sorrow. It's not so much that Jesus was depressed all the time. What it means is that he looked around him and he saw all the sorrow in the world and he took it on to himself. Every time he saw a need, he never left that need unanswered. Nobody even asked him. Nobody asked him to come. Nobody asked him to, hey, Jesus, like, we really need your help here. This lady, she's got nothing now and she needs your help. Nobody asked him. He saw a need and he sought it out. And is that something that you realize today, that when all hope is lost, Jesus, he does show up. He wants to be there to take care of your needs. He has compassion. And he said to her, do not weep. Man, I'm going to tell you right now, if you're ever at a funeral, there's a lot of things we want to follow Jesus' example in. This is not one of them. Don't go to somebody in a funeral and go, hey, stop crying. It's just, that's like the worst thing that you could ever do. And really, it's because you're not Jesus. And so if you're going up to someone and you're like, hey, stop crying, you can't take away their pain. The best we can do is empathize with them. We can comfort them. But a lot of times our comfort is just reminding them that somebody had died. There's not a lot we can do. So the best thing for you to do at a funeral is to not talk. I'm telling you right now, when someone is mourning, mourn with them. Don't say a word. Just be there for them. They don't need your cliches. They don't need, oh, they're in a better place, or, oh, they don't need any of that, because none of that's going to make it better. Let me tell you, I've been at funerals and none of that makes it better. The one thing that makes it better is to know somebody is there with you, feeling that same pain you feel. That you're having compassion, that you're taking their sorrow into yourself. That's what's helpful. But see, Jesus has every right to tell this lady, do not weep. And it wasn't like death didn't make Jesus sad. Jesus hated death. You know, it's funny, like I went to Bible college and I went to these classes, and one of my classes was just everything you do as a pastor. So like I learned how to do communion, I learned how to do baptisms, weddings, and even funerals. And one of our things was to find examples of each thing, like on YouTube, or to go to an example and to just see how it was done. And so one of the things I did is I looked through the Gospels. I'm like, hey, you know what? I'd love to see just a funeral in the Gospel. How did that go? Like, what did they say? What did they do? And I found out every funeral Jesus went to, he ruined. I mean, seriously, maybe you'd say he redeemed that funeral. Because every funeral Jesus went to, he would resurrect the person who had died. So probably not something I can ever do. If you call me to a funeral, I mean, I could try, but I don't know if he's going to give me that authority to raise somebody from the dead. But Jesus, he says, do not weep, because he's going to give her a reason not to weep. And it says he came and touched the open coffin, or the bier. It wasn't really like a box coffin. It was like almost like a couch. They would lay the dead body on this bier and they would walk, because they had to bury people outside the city. So there's a reason there's a procession and they're carrying this dead man. And it says he touched the coffin. It's almost like he's like, hold up. And people didn't do that, especially not rabbis, because when you touched a dead body, or when you touched something that was touching a dead body, you were unclean. So it's almost why you see, like it says here, he touched the open coffin and those who carried him stood still. They're like, what's going on? Nobody ever does this. Nobody ever touches the bier that the dead body's on, because now he's unclean. That wasn't something Jesus was worried about, ceremonial cleanliness, especially when there was a need. Need was always more important than rituals to Jesus. And so he touches the open coffin, and those who carried it, they stood still. They're like, what is going on? And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. It's interesting. He's talking to the dead body. It's because to Jesus, this man wasn't dead. Oh yeah, his physical body was definitely dead. But Jesus, he's talking to his spirit. And he says, young man, I say to you, arise. Just like the centurion, if you but say the word, Jesus had power in his words. And I imagine if he didn't say young man, if he didn't direct that speech to you, and if he just said arise, everybody in that vicinity probably would have arisen. There was power in the word of Jesus. And I love that he's come to this widow in her time of need and that he's addressing her need. It reminds me of Hebrews 4:16. It says, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus is always there for us in our time of need. He sees your pain, your sorrow. He sees when you're hurting. He sees you. And he has compassion. But he doesn't stop there. He acts. He doesn't just stop at seeing you or feeling sorry for you or taking your pain into himself. He acts. It's what Jesus does. And we find that Jesus can resurrect hope with just his word. He said to this young man, arise. And it says, so he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And Jesus presented him to his mother. What a scene that would be. This random stranger, because she doesn't know Jesus, comes up to this funeral procession, stops it, and then speaks to the mom first. And he's like, hey, don't weep. And then he goes to the dead body and he's like, yeah, rise. And the young man sits up and starts speaking. I don't know what he said. Probably, like, if it were me, I'd probably be like, hey, I'm hungry. Maybe he wanted something to eat. It doesn't tell us what he said. But how amazing is that right away there's that proof of life. Everybody in that town was mourning. Everybody in that town knew this man was dead, that it was hopeless. And all of a sudden, he's sitting up and speaking. There's hope again. And it reminds me kind of spiritually of our own lives, where your friends or loved ones, maybe they're spiritually dead. And man, you mourn for them and you pray for them and you're like, man, if they only could open their eyes, if only they'd have that moment with Jesus where he breathes new life into them, where he makes them alive. And you know, the amazing thing is when it does happen, when one of your loved ones comes to the Lord, one of the things they always do is they start speaking. They start telling people their testimony. They start telling people around them, look at what Jesus did in my life. And the more that he transforms them, the more they have to say. And I don't think we should ever look down on someone's testimony. Because man, that's the one thing you cannot take from me as my testimony. You can't take who I was and who Jesus has made me to be. No matter what you say, I know that's true. I know that this is who I was, and because of Jesus, this is who I am. And let me tell you, when you tell a testimony, that's the one thing I look for. To me, it's not a testimony if you don't tell me about that transformative moment with Jesus. And I'm not saying it's your fault if you're not used to telling testimonies. Most people don't know how to tell a testimony. So they'll tell a lot about who they were, and they'll tell a lot about who they are, but they forget that moment with Jesus. Never forget when you're telling a testimony to tell who it was that gave you that transformation. That's what makes a testimony. It's Jesus. And so you had this hopelessness. But hope it didn't die because Jesus showed up. And that's the next point, is that our hope can never die because Jesus is alive. And you see, it's still true to this day. The Bible tells us, Jesus tells us in the Bible that he is the resurrection and the life. I think that's John chapter 11. In John chapter 14, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus tells us that he is life. He has power over death. Even before he conquered death, he had power over death. The one problem, though, with these resurrections is that they're not real resurrections yet. It's like a glimpse of the resurrection. It's almost like a resuscitation, because what happened is that all these people that Jesus resurrected in the Bible, and I'm sure there were a lot more than what we read. There's 3 of them that we know of. There's this young man, there's Jairus' daughter, and there's Lazarus in John, or that's in John 11. But the Bible, John tells us, we didn't write down everything. If we tried to write down everything John or Jesus did, there aren't enough books in the world to write that much down. And so I imagine there were others that Jesus resurrected. But the problem with these resurrections is that they died again. It's kind of sad, but I imagine that mom never lost hope again. Because I imagine that every time she saw her son, she remembered that he was once dead and now he's alive. Can you imagine the joy that she felt for the rest of her life every time she looked at her son? Because she knew there was a time when she lost every bit of hope, when she lost everything, and now he's there. I don't think she ever lost hope again. And that's the thing about us Christians. It says in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, it says, we don't, or I think it's 4:13, it says, we don't grieve like others do. Yeah, we still grieve, but it's not the same as others because we have that hope that one day, that hope of glory, that one day we're going to be resurrected and it's going to be a real resurrection. It's not just this glimpse of the resurrection where we see that Jesus does have power over death. In Revelation, it says that Jesus is the firstborn of the dead. That seems kind of weird because we know there are other people who were raised from the dead. In the Old Testament, you had Elijah raising the widow's son. You had Jesus doing resurrections, but Jesus was the first one to ever be resurrected and never die again. He's the firstborn of the dead. He fully conquered death. And the hope, our glorious hope, is that one day we will forever live with him in eternity. That one day, he didn't just reunite this mother and son. One day he will reunite every mother and son who believes in him. Every husband and wife who lost each other. Everyone who's ever lost a loved one, who has put their faith and their trust in Jesus, will one day not even need hope anymore. That's why it says in 1 Corinthians 13:13 that so faith, hope, and love, they abide, these 3, but the greatest is love. Because when we're in heaven, we're not going to need faith anymore. God's going to be right there in front of us. We're not going to need to have faith in him. We're going to see him. We're not going to need hope anymore. The only thing we'll need at that point is love. And it's what will remain forever. But for right now, those things remain. They abide. They dwell in us. And they dwell in us because we have Jesus. Our hope can never die because Jesus is alive. And we're still looking for that time when he's going to come back for us. When one day, we're never going to know death again. It says in Ephesians 1:18, it says, having the eyes of your heart enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, that you may know the hope of glory. When you're a believer, that's what we're called to. We're called to that inheritance of heaven, of a relationship with him, of an eternity with him, that hope of glory that we all have. But the amazing thing is that when Jesus does things like this, he didn't do it for recognition. Nobody knew who he was. He didn't do it for anything but compassion for this lady. But the result was, verse 16. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. But fear came upon all. That word isn't that they were cowering in fear. It was this awe, this reverence that gripped them. And when it says it came upon them, that's literally what it's talking about. They were awestruck. They were standing there going, what just happened? This guy, he resurrected this young man, and now he's speaking, and this awe gripped them. And they glorified God. And you know, when we use our gifts, God has given us a lot of gifts. And he said, greater things will you do than I've done. He wasn't saying you're going to do better things, not greater in that way. He was talking about greater in number. You can't heal someone better than Jesus, but sometimes God does allow those miracles through us. And when we do those things, when we serve God, when we use his gifts, the one thing we should always be looking for is that those things glorify God and not us. How many times do you see that today? You see a faith healer, and everybody glorifies them. People aren't glorifying God. That's kind of how you know where their heart is, because they're not giving the glory to God. Jesus, God himself, the Son, came to glorify the Father. And if Jesus, who is our example, did that, then that's what we should do. We should glorify the Son and glorify the Father. And they said, a great prophet has risen up among us. They even asked John the Baptist, they're like, are you that? Because in the Old Testament, there was this prophecy that a greater prophet than Moses would one day come. And they said, John, are you that guy? And he's like, no, it's not me. It's the guy coming after me. And these guys are realizing that this is the one they've been waiting for. And it's amazing what they say next. A greater prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. How right they were. Now, this was a phrase they used. You find this phrase in Exodus and Psalms. And what it means is God is bringing favor to his people. He's visiting his people with blessings. But I don't think they realized what they were actually saying, because God had actually visited his people. He came down to bless them, to fill their needs, to have compassion on them, to give them hope once more. But you know, it's not just enough that we define hope, that we know what hope is, and I'm going to define it for you in a second, but we have to apply it. You have to realize that sometimes when things are at their darkest, that's the moment when God shows up and when his name is going to be glorified. You know, often it's not until things become impossible that God is able to step in and show up and really glorify his name. So many times we wonder, well, why am I going through this? We started a church, and 2 months in, I'm in the hospital and almost dead. Why, God? Why are you doing this? I even asked him to heal me. I think I've told you guys this before. I asked him before I went to the hospital, I'm like, if you could just heal me. And I literally had this impression from God going, how am I going to glorify my name if I just heal you and nobody knows about it? And I was like, fair point, Lord, but really, could you just heal me? But really, it's in our despair, it's when things are most dire that God is able to glorify his name. When he's able to show up. And so sometimes we don't realize that God is using those things in your life. And it's not like he's causing them. We live in a cursed world. Bad things are going to happen. But in those moments, God is able to show up. Paul knew this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through 9, he says, for we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. It's like, you guys don't know how hard these missionary trips were. It was beyond our strength. It was beyond our abilities. We even despaired of our lives. But he says, yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. And so Paul was saying, man, even though I'm weak, he's my strength. And even if death happens, which Paul did die once, and God raised him from the dead. How amazing is that? But a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. God has visited us. He visited them. And how amazing was that for them, because they had gone 400 years without a word from God. Probably wondering, does God care anymore about us? They had been defeated by the Romans. They didn't know where God was, and I'm sure they had lost hope. But we see that God sees them. We see that he has compassion on them, that he's visited his people. And then we see Jesus acting. That the Word became flesh and dwelt among them and had truly visited him, and didn't just come to give them his word, he acted. And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Jesus acts and people talk about it. And I want you to remember that in your own lives. When Jesus does something, when he sees you, when he has compassion, when he does act, share your testimony with others. Let them know what God is doing in your life. Because our hope is in Jesus, and our hope in God is not a wish. Do you guys realize that? When we're talking about hope and when we're talking about God, we're not talking about wishful thinking. God, I hope that you will see me and that you will have compassion and that you will act in this moment. That is not biblical hope. Biblical hope is the confident expectation of God's word and his promises. It's trust. I trust and I expect God to keep his word, for him to keep his promises. That is biblical hope. And I want to leave you guys with this question. What would change if you had the confident expectation that Jesus sees you with compassion and is ready to act? So in your life, in those deepest, darkest moments, when things are getting impossible, when you don't know how you're even going to get through this next day, what would change if you had the confident expectation that Jesus sees you with compassion and that he's ready to act? Let's pray.